Everyone in Grants, New Mexico, knew the Landis family lived paycheck to paycheck in a rusted Airstream trailer on County Road 53. Catherine Landis, 35, worked long shifts analyzing rock samples at Mesa Verde Mining Corporation's uranium site. Her 3 children, twins Ethan and Olivia, 9, and little Grace, 5, attended Grants Elementary, where teachers noticed their worn shoes and hand-me-down clothes. Neighbors saw Catherine as a devoted mother who sacrificed everything after her divorce. On October 14, 1998, she picked up her children early from school, telling the secretary she had an important meeting. By the next morning, the family had vanished. Their trailer sat locked and empty. Catherine's car remained in the driveway. Inside, dinner plates still held half-eaten food. The community assumed Catherine had run away from debt or an abusive ex-husband. Police filed reports, but the case grew cold within months. What no one knew was that Catherine Landis had discovered something beneath the desert floor that powerful people wanted buried forever. And when she refused to stay quiet, she and her children became the problem that needed to disappear. This is the story of how silence protected a crime for 26 years and how one woman's divorce shattered that silence wide open. If you believe justice has no expiration date, subscribe to this channel. The high desert of northwestern New Mexico carries a particular kind of silence. It is not the peaceful quiet of pastoral landscapes or the reverent hush of mountain forests. It is an ancient, indifferent stillness, the silence of a land that has watched civilizations rise and fall, that holds uranium in its sandstone bones and secrets in its abandoned mines. In October 1998, that silence would swallow a mother and her 3 children whole. Grants, New Mexico, sits along Interstate 40, roughly 80 miles west of Albuquerque. The town had once been the uranium capital of the world. During the Cold War boom of the 1950s and 1960s, prospectors flooded the region, striking deposits that would fuel America's nuclear arsenal. The population swelled to over 15,000. Mining companies built offices, processing plants, and company housing. Workers from across the country came seeking fortune in the radioactive earth. By 1998, most of that was memory. The uranium market had collapsed in the 1980s, leaving Grants a shadow of its former self. The population had dwindled to around 9,000. Abandoned mine shafts dotted the surrounding mesas like open wounds. Rusted equipment sat in fields of sagebrush. The few remaining mining operations ran skeleton crews, extracting what profit they could from depleted deposits. Mesa Verde Mining Corporation was one of these holdouts. The company operated a modest extraction site 15 miles north of town near the base of Mount Taylor, a sacred peak to the Navajo people, who called it Tzutzil, the turquoise mountain. Mesa Verde employed roughly 40 workers, miners, equipment operators, truck drivers, and a small administrative staff. Among them was a contract geologist named Catherine Landis. Catherine had arrived in Grants 3 years earlier, in the summer of 1995. She was 32 then, recently divorced, with 3 children under 7 and a geology degree from the University of Arizona that had never quite delivered the career she'd imagined. Her ex-husband, Derek Landis, had left her for a dental hygienist in Phoenix. The divorce settlement gave Catherine primary custody, but little else. Derek's landscaping business had been hemorrhaging money for years, and there wasn't much to divide. She'd found the job at Mesa Verde through a former classmate who worked in the New Mexico mining industry. The pay was modest, $34,000 a year, but it came with health insurance and predictable hours. Catherine rented a 1972 Airstream trailer on County Road 53, about 6 miles from the mine site. The trailer sat on a patch of scrubland owned by an elderly rancher named Hector Padilla, who charged her $200 a month and never complained when the rent came late. The airstream had seen better decades. Its aluminum skin was oxidized to a dull gray, and the floor creaked in specific spots that the children learned to avoid at night. But Catherine had made it a home. She'd hung curtains in the windows, taped the children's drawings to the curved walls, and planted a small garden of desert marigolds near the front steps. Inside, the space was cramped but organized, a testament to Catherine's methodical nature. Her days followed a rigid pattern. She woke at 5:30 a.m., prepared breakfast and packed lunches, drove the children to Grants Elementary by 7:45, then continued to the Mesa Verde site for her 8:30 start time. Her work consisted primarily of analyzing soil and rock samples, measuring radiation levels, and compiling data into weekly reports. It was tedious, detail-oriented labor that suited her temperament. Catherine had always preferred numbers to people. Equations didn't lie or leave or disappoint. The children adapted to their new life with the resilience common to kids who have survived upheaval. Ethan, the older twin by 4 minutes, was quiet and watchful, with his mother's dark hair and his father's habit of chewing his lip when nervous. Olivia was his opposite in temperament, gregarious, chatty, prone to dramatic declarations about fairness and justice. At 9, she had already announced her intention to become either a lawyer or a veterinarian, depending on which career involved more arguing. Grace, the youngest, existed in her own gentle world. She was small for 5, with wispy blonde hair that Catherine suspected came from some distant Scandinavian ancestor. Grace carried a stuffed rabbit named Mr. Buttons everywhere, spoke to it in whispered conversations, and seemed perpetually surprised by the loudness and chaos of the world around her. Her kindergarten teacher, Mrs. Archuleta, had described her as ethereal, a word Catherine had to look up and then found oddly appropriate. The community of Grants regarded the Landis family with the particular sympathy reserved for struggling single mothers. At Grants Elementary, teachers slipped extra snacks into the children's backpacks. At Smith's grocery store on Santa Fe Avenue, the checkout clerks pretended not to notice when Catherine counted coins from her purse. At Mesa Verde, her supervisor, a gruff foreman named Dale Hendricks, scheduled her shifts to align with school hours whenever possible. Catherine accepted these kindnesses without comment. Pride was a luxury she couldn't afford. She had learned, in the 3 years since Derek left, that survival required a kind of practical humility, the willingness to take help when offered and ask for it when necessary. What she refused to accept was pity. When co-workers suggested she apply for food stamps or welfare, she changed the subject. When her mother in Tucson offered to take the children for a while, Catherine said no. The family would stay together. That was the one thing she would not compromise. What her colleagues and neighbors didn't know, what no one in Grants knew, was that Catherine Landis had begun asking questions that would put her family in danger. It started in August 1998, during a routine sampling run near the northern perimeter of the Mesa Verde site. Catherine had been assigned to collect soil samples from a grid of test points, part of the company's quarterly environmental compliance report. The work was standard: dig 6 inches down, fill a sample container, label it, move to the next point. She had done it dozens of times. But at grid point N17, near the fence line that separated the active mining area from a cluster of abandoned shafts, her Geiger counter spiked. The reading was 847 microroentgens per hour, nearly 3 times the expected background level for this part of the site. Catherine frowned, rechecked her equipment, and took another reading. The number held steady. This wasn't impossible. Uranium deposits were uneven, and localized hotspots existed throughout the region. But N17 was documented as a low-activity zone. Catherine had reviewed the geological surveys herself. The readings shouldn't be this high. She collected her sample, marked the anomaly in her field notes, and continued her route. But the number stayed with her. That evening, after putting the children to bed, she pulled out the site maps she kept in a filing cabinet under the trailer's fold-down table. Grid point N17 sat roughly 200 meters from the entrance to shaft number 7, one of the abandoned mines that predated Mesa Verde's current operations. Shaft number 7 had been closed since 1979, sealed with concrete and chain-link fencing after the uranium market's first major crash. According to company records, it had been a marginally productive dig that exhausted its economically viable deposits within 8 years. There was no reason for elevated radiation levels in its vicinity unless something had been added to the site after closure. Catherine told herself she was being paranoid. Mining sites were complex. Groundwater migration could transport radioactive particles. Equipment from active areas could contaminate previously clean zones. There were a dozen innocent explanations, but she was a scientist, and scientists tested hypotheses. Over the following weeks, Catherine began an unofficial investigation. She adjusted her sampling routes to pass near shaft number 7, taking readings at intervals around its perimeter. The pattern that emerged was troubling. Radiation levels increased as she approached the sealed mine entrance, peaking at over 1,200 microroentgens per hour, directly adjacent to the concrete cap. The gradient was wrong for natural deposits. It suggested a concentrated source rather than dispersed ore. She also noticed something else. According to her employment records, Mesa Verde had contracted with a waste disposal company called Consolidated Environmental Services to handle radioactive materials from the site. This was standard practice. Mining operations generated low-level waste that required specialized handling. But when Catherine cross-referenced the disposal manifests with her own production records, the numbers didn't match. The site was generating roughly 40 cubic meters of low-level radioactive waste per quarter. Consolidated Environmental Services was billing for the disposal of only 15 cubic meters. The discrepancy had persisted for at least 2 years, as far back as the records Catherine could access. Where was the other 25 cubic meters going? In mid-September, Catherine's investigation brought her into contact with Ronald Gates, the company's administrative manager. Gates was a thin, meticulous man in his early 40s, responsible for payroll, procurement, and record-keeping at the Mesa Verde site. He had worked for the company for 15 years and was known for his photographic memory of invoices and purchase orders. When Catherine requested access to older disposal manifests, claiming she needed them for a compliance report, Gates had studied her with pale blue eyes that seemed to catalog everything they saw. "These records are archived off-site," he said. "It'll take a few days to retrieve them." "That's fine. I'm not in a hurry." "May I ask what specifically you're looking for?" Catherine kept her voice casual. "Just cross-referencing some numbers, making sure our quarterly reports are consistent." Gates nodded slowly. "Consistency is important." He wrote something on a notepad, a note to himself, perhaps, or a reminder. "I'll have those files for you by Friday." The files never arrived. When Catherine followed up the next week, Gates apologized. There had been a mix-up at the storage facility, some boxes mislabeled, the usual bureaucratic confusion. He promised to keep looking. Catherine didn't push. But she noticed that Gates had started watching her more closely. At lunch, she would catch him glancing in her direction from across the break room. In the parking lot after shifts, his sedan seemed to linger until she had driven away. It could have been coincidence. It could have been paranoia. It could also have been surveillance. Catherine considered her options. She could report her findings to Dale Hendricks, her immediate supervisor. But Dale was a company man, 30 years with Mesa Verde, counting the months until his pension kicked in. He wouldn't want to hear that the company might be illegally dumping radioactive waste. He would tell her to mind her own business, or worse, report her curiosity to management. She could contact the Nuclear Regulatory Commission directly. But that would mean going over everyone's heads, triggering a federal investigation that could shut down the site and cost 40 people their jobs, including her own. Catherine needed this job. Her children needed her to have this job. Or she could gather more evidence first, build an airtight case, then approach management with documentation so thorough that denial would be impossible. Give them a chance to fix the problem before the regulators got involved. It was the cautious approach, the diplomatic approach. It was also, Catherine would later realize, a fatal mistake. On the morning of October 12, 1998, Catherine requested a meeting with Howard Prescott, the site director of Mesa Verde Mining Corporation. Prescott was a Texas transplant in his late 50s, with silver hair, an easy smile, and the particular confidence of men who had never doubted their right to be in charge. He'd run Mesa Verde for 11 years, navigating the company through market downturns, regulatory changes, and 3 rounds of layoffs. Workers respected him. Investors trusted him. He played golf with the mayor of Grants and donated generously to local charities. Catherine had interacted with Prescott only a handful of times, quarterly review meetings mostly, where she presented her environmental reports to board executives who signed off without reading them. But she'd heard stories. Prescott was pleasant until he wasn't. Cross him, and you'd find yourself reassigned to night shifts or suddenly redundant during the next restructuring. She drafted her request carefully. Site Director Prescott, I've identified some anomalies in recent sampling data that I believe warrant discussion. The matter is sensitive and may require action before our next quarterly report. I'm available to meet at your convenience. Respectfully, Catherine Landis, Contract Geologist. The response came within hours. Catherine, my schedule is open Wednesday afternoon. Come by at 2 p.m. Looking forward to hearing your concerns. H.P. The tone was friendly enough. Maybe too friendly. Catherine wondered if Prescott already knew what she'd found, if word had traveled through the small community of the mining site, perhaps through Ronald Gates, who seemed to track every document that moved through the company. But she pushed the thought aside. She was being paranoid again. Prescott was busy. He probably had no idea what her anomalies referred to. On October 13th, the day before the meeting, Catherine worked late organizing her documentation. She'd assembled a folder of evidence: radiation readings from the N17 grid and surrounding areas, disposal manifests showing the discrepancy in waste volumes, a map of shaft number 7 with contamination gradients marked in colored pencil. She'd also drafted a memo summarizing her findings in clear, non-accusatory language. The memo concluded with a recommendation. Before any external reporting becomes necessary, I suggest a joint inspection of shaft number 7's perimeter to identify the source of elevated radiation levels. If the contamination is migrating from natural deposits, mitigation options exist. If it originates from undocumented waste disposal, immediate remediation will be required to ensure compliance with NRC regulations. She was giving them an out, a chance to claim ignorance and fix the problem quietly. It was more than they deserved if her suspicions were correct. That night, after the children were asleep, Catherine sat at the trailer's small kitchen table and stared at the folder. She thought about what it contained. Evidence of environmental crimes, probably. Proof that her employer had been poisoning the land, the water, the people of this community, and she was the only one who had noticed, the only one who had bothered to connect the dots. She thought about Grace, asleep in the narrow bunk she shared with Olivia, clutching Mr. Buttons. She thought about Ethan, who had started having nightmares recently, dreams where his father came back and took him away. She thought about the $847 in her checking account, the credit card debt she'd been slowly paying down, the child support payments that came sporadically and never quite on time. If she pushed this, she could lose everything: her job, her home, her ability to provide for her children. Whistleblowers were not rewarded in corporate America. They were punished, blacklisted, made examples of. But if she stayed silent, she was complicit. The contamination would spread. More people would be exposed. Maybe they already had been. Maybe the elevated cancer rates she'd read about in the Grants Beacon, the cluster of leukemia cases among former miners, the children born with birth defects, weren't just bad luck. Maybe they were the consequence of decisions made in boardrooms by men like Howard Prescott. Catherine closed the folder. She would go to the meeting, she would present her evidence, and she would see what kind of man Howard Prescott really was. October 14th, 1998 began like any other Wednesday. Catherine woke at 5:30, showered in the trailer's cramped bathroom, and prepared breakfast: oatmeal with raisins for the children, black coffee for herself. The twins argued over who got the blue bowl. Grace hummed to Mr. Buttons, explaining that today was going to be a special day, though she couldn't say why. At 7:40 a.m., Catherine loaded the children into her 1989 Honda Accord, a vehicle she'd bought used the year before, with 127,000 miles on the odometer and a persistent rattle in the left rear wheel well. The drive to Grants Elementary took 12 minutes, winding along County Road 53 until it merged with Highway 53, then into the residential streets of downtown Grants. She parked in the school's circular driveway at 7:52. Other parents were dropping off children, waving goodbye, rushing to their own jobs. Catherine walked Ethan and Olivia to the door of their fourth-grade classroom, reminded them about their permission slips for the upcoming field trip to El Malpais National Monument, and hugged each of them, a little longer than usual, perhaps, though neither child noticed. Then she walked Grace to the kindergarten wing, knelt down to her daughter's eye level, and straightened the collar of her pink shirt. "Be good today, sweetheart." Grace nodded solemnly. "Mr. Buttons says you look worried." Catherine smiled despite herself. "Tell Mr. Buttons that Mommy has a meeting today with an important man. I'm just a little nervous." "Mr. Buttons says nervous is okay, but don't forget to breathe." "I won't." Catherine kissed her daughter's forehead, watched her disappear into Mrs. Archuletta's classroom, and returned to her car. At 8:25 a.m., she arrived at the Mesa Verde site. The morning passed in routine tasks, calibrating equipment, logging samples from the previous day, entering data into the company's antiquated computer system. Her colleagues noticed nothing unusual. Later, they would tell investigators that Catherine had seemed maybe a little distracted or quieter than normal, but nothing that raised alarm. At 1:45 p.m., Catherine gathered her folder of evidence and walked to the administrative building, a prefabricated structure at the center of the site that housed the offices of senior management. She signed in with the receptionist, a young woman named Linda, who offered her a cup of coffee, and took a seat in the waiting area. Through the glass partition, she could see Ronald Gates at his desk in the adjacent office, his pale eyes flicking toward her and then away. He picked up his phone, spoke a few words, and hung up. Catherine felt a chill that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. At 2:03 p.m., Howard Prescott's door opened. "Catherine, come on in." His office was larger than she'd remembered. Oak desk, leather chairs, framed photographs of Prescott shaking hands with various dignitaries. A window behind the desk looked out over the mining operation, trucks crawling across the scarred landscape like insects. Prescott gestured to a chair across from his desk. "Please, sit. Can I get you anything? Water?" Linda makes a decent pot of coffee if you can stomach it. I'm fine, thank you. Well then. Prescott settled into his own chair, folded his hands on the desk, and smiled. It was a practiced smile, the kind that reached his eyes but no further. Your email mentioned anomalies. That sounds ominous. Catherine opened her folder. I've been conducting routine sampling near the northern perimeter, and I've identified radiation levels significantly above expected background. She slid the first page across the desk, a table of readings with the anomalous values highlighted in yellow. Prescott glanced at it without picking it up. Go on. The elevated readings are concentrated around shaft number 7, which has been closed since 1979. The gradient pattern suggests a localized source rather than natural deposit migration. She added the map with the contamination overlay. Then the disposal manifests. I also noticed a discrepancy in our waste disposal records. We're generating approximately 40 cubic meters of low-level waste per quarter, but our disposal contractor is only billing for 15. The gap has been consistent for at least 2 years. Prescott's expression hadn't changed. He was still smiling, still relaxed, but something in his eyes had shifted, a flicker of calculation, quickly suppressed. That's quite thorough, he said. You've been busy. I was concerned. If there's a compliance issue, I thought management should know before it became an external matter. Very prudent, very professional. Prescott leaned back in his chair. Tell me, Catherine, have you shared these findings with anyone else? Co-workers, friends, family? The question was casual. Too casual. No, I wanted to bring it to you first. Good. That's exactly right. Internal channels, chain of command. That's how professionals handle sensitive matters. He stood, walked to the window, and looked out at the mining operation. You know, this company has been operating for 32 years. 32 years of providing jobs to this community, tax revenue to this county, energy resources to this nation. That's a legacy I'm proud of. Catherine waited. Anomalies happen in this business. Equipment malfunctions. Records get misfiled. Sometimes our disposal contractors cut corners, bill us for work they didn't do, pocket the difference. It's frustrating, but it's not criminal. The radiation levels around shaft 7 are not a clerical error. Prescott turned to face her. His smile was gone. No, I don't suppose they are. He returned to his desk, sat down, and studied her for a long moment. What do you want, Catherine? I want to know what's in that shaft, and I want it cleaned up before anyone else gets exposed. Before you go to the regulators, you mean? I'd rather not involve the NRC, but I will if I have to. Prescott nodded slowly. Family, right? 3 kids. One of them's just started kindergarten. That's young, vulnerable age. Catherine felt the temperature in the room drop. Are you threatening my children? I'm observing that you have responsibilities, people who depend on you. It would be a shame if something disrupted your ability to meet those responsibilities. This meeting is over. Catherine stood, gathered her documents, and walked toward the door. Leave the folder, Prescott said. She didn't stop. She didn't look back. She walked out of the administrative building, past Linda's reception desk, past Ronald Gates, who watched her with those cataloging eyes, across the parking lot to her car. Her hands were shaking as she unlocked the door. She sat in the driver's seat for a full minute, breathing deeply, trying to process what had just happened. Prescott hadn't denied anything. He'd pivoted straight to intimidation, which meant her suspicions were correct. Mesa Verde was dumping radioactive waste in Shaft 7, had probably been doing it for years, and management knew. She had to go to the NRC today, before Prescott could do whatever he was planning to do. But first, she needed to pick up the children. Get them somewhere safe. Maybe her mother's house in Tucson. Yes. She would drive to Grants Elementary, pull them out of class, and keep driving south until she reached the Arizona border. She could call the NRC from a payphone in Phoenix. Anonymous tip, let them investigate. By the time Prescott realized what had happened, she'd be hundreds of miles away. Catherine started the engine and drove toward Grants. At 2:47 p.m., she parked in the circular driveway of Grants Elementary, walked into the front office, and told the secretary, Mrs. Cordero, the same woman who had given her concerned looks so many times before, that she needed to take her children home early. "Family emergency," Catherine said. "I've already cleared it with their teachers." She hadn't, but Mrs. Cordero didn't check. She paged the classrooms, and within 10 minutes, Ethan, Olivia, and Grace were gathered in the office, backpacks on, confused but obedient. "Is everything okay, Mom?" Ethan asked in the car. "Everything's fine, sweetheart. We're just going on a little trip." "Where?" "To see Grandma. Won't that be nice?" Grace clapped her hands. "Mr. Buttons loves Grandma." Olivia narrowed her eyes. She was always the suspicious one. "It's a school day. We never go on trips on school days." "Special circumstances." Catherine checked her mirrors, pulled out of the parking lot, and headed toward Highway 53. "I'll explain later, I promise." The drive to the trailer took 12 minutes. Catherine had a mental list: clothes for 4 days, toiletries, the children's favorite toys, the folder of evidence she'd kept from Prescott's office, the $847 in her checking account accessible via ATM. She could be on the road by 4 p.m. in Tucson by midnight if she pushed it. She turned onto County Road 53 at 3:08 p.m. The trailer was visible from half a mile away, its dull aluminum shape unmistakable against the brown scrubland. So was the white cargo van parked beside it. Catherine slowed. The van had no markings, no company logo, no license plate visible from this angle. 2 men stood near the trailer's front door. They wore jeans and work boots, the anonymous uniform of manual laborers across the Southwest. One of them was smoking a cigarette. The other was watching the road, watching her approach. Catherine's foot hovered over the brake pedal. Every instinct screamed at her to stop, to turn around, to drive in the opposite direction and never look back. "Mom?" Ethan's voice was uncertain. "Who are those men?" Catherine made a decision. She pressed the accelerator. "Hold on, kids!" The Honda surged forward, passing the trailer at 45 miles per hour. In her rearview mirror, she saw the 2 men react, one of them dropping his cigarette, the other pulling something from his jacket. She didn't wait to see what it was. County Road 53 was a straight shot for another 2 miles before it intersected with Highway 53. If she could reach the highway, she could head east toward Albuquerque, find a police station, tell them everything. 2 miles, maybe 3 minutes at this speed. The white van's engine roared to life behind her. Catherine pushed the accelerator to the floor. The Honda's engine whined in protest, the speedometer climbing past 60, then 70. The car shuddered. It wasn't built for this kind of speed on unpaved roads. Gravel pinged against the undercarriage like gunfire. In the back seat, Grace started crying. Olivia wrapped her arms around her sister. Ethan pressed his face against the window, watching the van grow larger in the side mirror. "Mom, they're catching up." "I know, baby, I know." The van was less than 50 feet behind now, its engine a throaty growl that seemed to swallow the desert silence. Catherine could see the driver's face through the windshield, the man who had been smoking, his expression blank, professional. This was just a job to him. Whatever happened next was just a job. She saw the highway intersection ahead, maybe half a mile. A semi-truck was passing through, heading west. If she could reach the highway, merge into traffic, find witnesses. The van pulled alongside her. Through the passenger window, the second man gestured with something metal, a gun. He pointed at the road ahead, then at her, then at the road again. "Pull over." Catherine gripped the steering wheel tighter. She thought about her children in the back seat, Ethan's frightened eyes, Olivia's fierce protectiveness, Grace's quiet sobbing. She thought about what these men would do if she stopped. She thought about what they would do if she didn't. The van swerved into her lane. Catherine yanked the wheel right, sending the Accord onto the gravel shoulder. The tires lost traction. She felt the car begin to slide, the rear end fishtailing in the loose dirt. She overcorrected, a mistake, the worst mistake, and the car spun. The world became a blur of brown and blue, desert and sky. The children screamed. Catherine held the wheel as if it could save them, as if anything could save them now. The car rotated once, twice, then lurched to a stop facing the wrong direction, engine still running, dust billowing around them like a burial shroud. Through the settling dust, Catherine saw the white van backing toward her. The two men climbed out, moving with the unhurried confidence of predators who had cornered their prey. The one with the gun kept it low, hidden from any passing traffic. Not that there was any. County Road 53 was empty in both directions. They were alone. Catherine looked at her children in the rearview mirror. Ethan had gone pale. Olivia was holding Grace so tightly the little girl could barely breathe. Mr. Buttons had fallen to the floor, his button eyes staring up at nothing. "I love you," Catherine said. "All of you. Whatever happens, remember that Mommy loves you." The man with the gun reached her door. That evening, Hector Padilla noticed that Catherine Landis's car was not in its usual spot beside the trailer. This was unusual. Catherine rarely went out after dark, especially with the children. But Hector was 73 years old and had learned long ago not to involve himself in other people's business. He assumed she'd taken the kids to a movie in Grants, or maybe to visit a friend. He went to bed early and thought nothing more of it. The next morning, October 15th, Hector woke to find the situation changed. Catherine's car was back, parked in the driveway at an odd angle, as if someone had been in a hurry. The driver's door hung open. The trailer lights were on, had been on all night, it seemed, because he could see them glowing faintly, even in the morning sun. Something about the scene felt staged, like a theater set after the actors had gone home. Hector walked over to check, just to make sure everything was all right. He noticed that the car's keys were still in the ignition. Catherine's purse sat on the passenger seat, wallet visible inside. No one left their purse in an unlocked car overnight, not unless they planned to come right back. He knocked on the trailer door. No answer. He tried the handle. Locked. Through the window he could see the kitchen table, where 4 plates of half-eaten spaghetti sat untouched. The overhead light was on. A chair had been knocked over, and on the floor near the table, almost hidden by the counter's shadow, he saw a small stuffed rabbit with gray ears. Grace never went anywhere without that rabbit. Hector Padilla called the McKinley County Sheriff's Office at 8:17 a.m. Deputy Marcus Whitehorse arrived at 9:04 a.m. He was 31 years old, a Navajo man who had grown up in Gallup and joined the sheriff's department after 4 years in the Army. He had investigated missing persons cases before, usually runaways, occasionally domestic disputes that ended with someone driving to a relative's house in another state. He expected this call to be something similar. The scene didn't match his expectations. The evidence told a contradictory story. The car's return suggested Catherine had come home after all, but the open door, the abandoned purse, the untouched dinner, the overturned chair, all pointed to an interrupted departure. Someone had gone to considerable effort to make it look like Catherine Landis had come back, started dinner for her children, and then simply walked away. But they had made mistakes. The car was angled wrong for someone parking normally. The dinner plates held SpaghettiOs, a meal Catherine could have prepared quickly, but the milk in the glasses had curdled overnight, meaning the table had been set at least 12 hours ago, and no mother would leave without her 5-year-old's favorite toy. Deputy Whitehorse took photographs, bagged the notepad and phone as evidence, and began canvassing the area. Hector Padilla described seeing the white cargo van the previous afternoon, around 3, maybe a little after, but hadn't paid close attention. He couldn't describe the men or provide a license plate number. "I should have looked closer," the old man said, his weathered face creased with guilt. "I should have done something." "You couldn't have known," Whitehorse said. But he noted the detail in his report. The van had arrived before Catherine and the children returned from school. That meant someone had been waiting for them. At 2:15 p.m., the deputy drove to Mesa Verde Mining Corporation to inquire about Catherine Landis's employment status. He was met by the site's administrative manager, Ronald Gates. Whitehorse recognized the type immediately. Gates was the kind of man who filed everything in triplicate, who remembered every invoice and every personnel file, who knew where all the bodies were buried, metaphorically speaking. His handshake was dry and brief. His pale eyes catalogued Whitehorse the same way they probably catalogued everything else. "Catherine Landis?" Gates checked a file on his desk. Already prepared, Whitehorse noticed, as if he'd known this visit was coming. "She resigned last week, October 7th. Said she was moving to be closer to family." He produced a resignation letter, typed and signed in what appeared to be Catherine's handwriting. "We were sorry to see her go. Good worker. Kept to herself, mostly." "Did she seem upset about anything? Problems with co-workers? Disagreements with management?" Gates's expression didn't flicker. "Nothing I'm aware of. She was professional, competent. There were no issues." Deputy Whitehorse asked if he could examine Catherine's personnel file. "Of course. I'll have copies made for your records." The file contained nothing remarkable. Performance reviews, satisfactory. Attendance records, excellent. Emergency contact information, Derek Landis in Phoenix, relationship listed as ex-husband. No disciplinary actions, no complaints, no indication of any conflict with management. Whitehorse thanked Gates for his cooperation and returned to his cruiser. Something about the interview bothered him. The administrative manager had been too helpful, too prepared. Every document was exactly where it should be. Every answer came without hesitation. In Whitehorse's experience, that level of organization either meant exceptional competence or advanced preparation. He couldn't prove which. On October 16th, the investigation officially opened as a missing persons case. Catherine Landis, age 35, and her 3 children, Ethan, Olivia, and Grace Landis, were listed as voluntarily missing pending further evidence of foul play. The search expanded over the following days. Deputies canvassed grants, showing photographs of Catherine and the children at gas stations, restaurants, and motels along the major highways. No one had seen them. An APB was issued for the white cargo van Hector Padilla had described, but without a license plate or distinguishing features, the bulletin generated no useful leads. On October 19th, investigators contacted Derek Landis in Phoenix. He expressed shock at the news, seemingly genuine shock, and provided documentation proving he'd been at work on October 14th and 15. His alibi was verified by his employer and 3 co-workers. Whatever had happened to Catherine and the children, Derek was not responsible. He did, however, offer one piece of useful information. Catherine had called him on October 10th, 4 days before she disappeared. She sounded scared, Derek told investigators. Said she'd found something at work, something big. I asked her what, but she wouldn't say over the phone. Said she didn't trust the lines. Did she say what she planned to do about it? Just that she was going to handle it. That's what she said. I'm going to handle it, Derek. For once in my life, I'm going to do the right thing. This was the first indication that Catherine's disappearance might be connected to her employment at Mesa Verde. Deputy Whitehorse brought the information to his supervisor, Sheriff Raymond Begay, who authorized a more thorough review of the mining company's operations. But the review went nowhere. Mesa Verde's records were meticulous, or at least they appeared to be. Environmental reports showed no anomalies. Disposal manifests matched regulatory requirements. When investigators asked about Catherine's work specifically, they were told her duties had been routine and her departure amicable. She gave 2 weeks' notice, Ronald Gates explained during a follow-up interview. Said she wanted to take the kids to Tucson, be closer to her mother. We wished her well. The resignation letter was authenticated by a handwriting expert contracted by the sheriff's department. The signature was Catherine's, or close enough to satisfy the analysis. The expert noted some minor inconsistencies in letter spacing, but attributed them to the difference between handwriting produced under normal circumstances and handwriting produced in haste. The sheriff's department budget didn't allow for a more thorough examination. By November 1998, the Landis case had stalled. Without evidence of abduction, without a body, without witnesses willing to come forward, there was nothing to investigate. The file remained open but inactive, one of hundreds of missing persons cases in New Mexico that year. Catherine Landis and her 3 children had simply vanished. In Grants, people talked. Theories circulated at the coffee shops and church potlucks that sustained small-town social life. Some believed Catherine had fled her debts. The struggling single-mother narrative made this plausible, even sympathetic. Others suspected Derek, despite his alibi. Ex-husbands were always suspects, especially ones who had abandoned their families. A few whispered about darker possibilities: human trafficking, cartel involvement, the kind of violence that seemed to seep up from the border like groundwater. No one suspected Mesa Verde Mining Corporation. The company continued operations throughout the investigation and afterward. Howard Prescott retired in 2003, citing health reasons, and moved to a golf community in Scottsdale. Ronald Gates was promoted to site director, a position he held until the company ceased operations in 2011, a casualty of declining uranium prices and tightening environmental regulations. When Mesa Verde declared bankruptcy in 2011, the McKinley County Sheriff's Department briefly revisited the Landis case. The company's closure meant its records would be transferred to state archives, an opportunity to examine files that had previously been protected by corporate confidentiality. Detective Marcus Whitehorse, now a lieutenant, personally oversaw the review, but the records revealed nothing. Whatever documentation might have connected Mesa Verde to Catherine's disappearance had been thoroughly purged. The files from 1998 were incomplete, with gaps that could be attributed to normal record-keeping lapses or deliberate destruction. Without witnesses, without physical evidence, the case remained cold. Shaft number 7 was never inspected. Its concrete cap remained sealed, its chain-link fencing intact, its secrets buried beneath 60 feet of New Mexico sandstone. And the silence of the high desert continued, indifferent as ever, keeping its promises to no one. The years passed the way years do in small towns, slowly, imperceptibly, marked by graduations and funerals and the steady replacement of one generation by the next. The Landis case faded from public memory. The trailer on County Road 53 sat empty for 3 years before Hector Padilla finally had it towed away. The plot returned to scrubland, indistinguishable from the surrounding desert. At Grants Elementary, teachers who had known the Landis children retired or moved away. Mrs. Archuleta, Grace's kindergarten teacher, kept a photograph of the class of 1998 in her desk drawer until her death in 2015. In the photo, Grace Landis sits in the front row, Mr. Buttons clutched to her chest, smiling at something just outside the frame. Derek Landis, remarried in 2001, divorced again in 2006, and died of a heart attack in 2019. He never stopped wondering what had happened to his children. In his final years, he hired a private investigator to review the case, a retired Phoenix detective who charged him $15,000 and found nothing the original investigation had missed. The McKinley County Sheriff's Department changed hands multiple times. Lieutenant Marcus Whitehorse was promoted to captain, then retired in 2020 after 32 years of service. He kept a copy of the Landis file in his personal records, reviewing it occasionally, always reaching the same frustrating conclusion. There was nothing more he could have done. The evidence had pointed toward Mesa Verde, but pointing wasn't proving. And without proof, there was no justice. The case was cold. It had been cold for a quarter-century. Everyone who might have known the truth was either dead, retired, or protected by the passage of time. Then, in March 2024, Patricia Gates filed for divorce. She was 67 years old and had been married to Ronald Gates for 42 years. They had raised 2 children, both grown now, with families of their own, in a comfortable house in Albuquerque's North Valley. Ronald had provided well. The house was paid off. The retirement accounts were substantial. To outside observers, the marriage appeared successful. But Patricia had discovered 3 months earlier that her husband had been having an affair. The woman was a former colleague at Mesa Verde, someone Ronald had known for decades, someone Patricia had hosted at dinner parties and Christmas gatherings without ever suspecting. The affair had been going on for at least 15 years, maybe longer. The discovery had come through the most mundane of channels, a credit card statement showing monthly charges at a Santa Fe hotel Patricia had never visited. Patricia was not a vengeful person by nature. She had spent her adult life as a homemaker, a mother, a dutiful wife, who deferred to her husband's judgment in matters large and small. She had been raised to believe that marriage was permanent, that difficulties were to be endured, that a woman's role was to make peace rather than war. But something about this betrayal, its duration, its intimacy, its casual cruelty, broke something inside her. 15 years, half of her children's lives, half of her own middle age. All those evenings when Ronald claimed to be working late, all those weekends when he said he was golfing with clients, all those times she had trusted him and he had lied. She didn't want peace anymore. She wanted justice. She wanted Ronald to suffer the way she had suffered, to lose the things he valued the way she had lost her faith in their life together. She filed for divorce on March 3, 2024, citing irreconcilable differences. She hired an attorney named Elena Vasquez, a specialist in high-asset divorces who had a reputation for thoroughness and an even stronger reputation for winning. The discovery process began in April. Ronald's finances were more complex than Patricia had realized. Multiple bank accounts, investment portfolios, a rental property in Santa Fe she hadn't known existed. Vasquez suspected there was more. Offshore accounts, perhaps, or hidden assets that wouldn't appear on standard financial disclosures. "There's usually a safe," she told Patricia during a strategy meeting. "Men like your husband, men who keep secrets professionally, almost always have a safe. Somewhere they store the things they don't want anyone to find. Do you know where he keeps important documents?" Patricia thought about it. "There's a safe in his home office. He's had it for years. I've never seen inside. He said it was for work documents, proprietary information from the mining company. I never questioned it. We'll need access. If he won't provide the combination voluntarily, we can petition the court for an order." Ronald refused. His attorney argued that the safe contained confidential business documents unrelated to the marriage, proprietary information from his years at Mesa Verde that could not be disclosed without violating non-disclosure agreements with former employers. Judge Carmen Delgado, who had presided over enough contentious divorces to recognize a stalling tactic, was unimpressed. On June 17, 2024, she issued an order requiring Ronald Gates to open the safe and submit its contents to court-supervised inventory. Any genuinely confidential business documents would be reviewed by the court and excluded from discovery if appropriate. Everything else was fair game. Ronald's attorney filed an emergency appeal. It was denied. The safe was opened on June 24, 2024, in the presence of both attorneys, a court-appointed referee, and Patricia herself. The setting was Ronald's home office, a wood-paneled room with hunting prints on the walls and a large mahogany desk that Patricia had always found pretentious. The safe sat in the corner, a fireproof model roughly 3 feet tall, its digital keypad glowing faintly in the afternoon light. Ronald entered the combination with the expression of a man walking to his own execution. The lock clicked. The door swung open. Inside, they found what you might expect from a man with something to hide: $34,000 in cash, bundled in neat stacks. A collection of gold coins worth approximately $50,000, 3 USB drives that would later be determined to contain records of offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands. A second cell phone, the affair phone, Patricia realized with a fresh surge of anger, and at the bottom of the safe, beneath everything else, a manila folder labeled Mesa Verde 1998, Confidential. The folder was thick with age, its edges worn, its contents yellowed by 26 years in the dark. Patricia watched the referee extract it and place it on the desk. She didn't know what it contained. She had never heard her husband mention anything about 1998 that seemed significant. The referee opened the folder and began cataloging its contents for the record. One typed memorandum dated October 12, 1998. Subject line reads, "Landis problem, recommended action." One handwritten note with what appears to be GPS coordinates. One photocopy of a document titled Voluntary Resignation, bearing the name Catherine Landis, with a signature at the bottom. Several pages of internal correspondence between— "Stop!" Elena Vasquez's voice was sharp enough to cut glass. She had moved closer to the desk, close enough to read the memorandum's first paragraph. Her face had gone pale. "These documents may constitute evidence of criminal activity. This inventory needs to be suspended immediately pending consultation with law enforcement." The referee looked up, startled. "On what basis?" Vasquez pointed to the memorandum. Her hand was trembling slightly. "I can see the text from here. It references permanent resolution and disposal logistics in the context of a personnel problem. In conjunction with GPS coordinates and what appears to be a forged resignation letter, this could be evidence of—" She paused, visibly collecting herself. "This needs to go to the FBI. Today. Right now." Patricia stared at the folder. She thought about the name in the subject line. Landis. It was familiar somehow. A news story from years ago, maybe. A local tragedy she'd half forgotten. Then she remembered. The missing woman. The single mother with 3 children who had disappeared from Grants in the late 1990s. It had been all over the local news for months. People had speculated endlessly about what had happened to her, the struggling mother who vanished without a trace, leaving behind an empty trailer and an abandoned car. Patricia remembered discussing it at a dinner party, remembered Ronald saying something dismissive about how the woman had probably just run off with a boyfriend, abandoned her responsibilities the way some people did. She looked at her husband now. Ronald had gone pale. His attorney was whispering urgently in his ear, something about Fifth Amendment rights, and refusing to answer questions. But Ronald wasn't listening. He was staring at the folder on the desk, at the documents that had just been exposed to daylight for the first time in 26 years. His secrets, his insurance policy, his guarantee that no one could ever touch him without taking others down too. All of it suddenly visible to the woman he had betrayed and the lawyers who would destroy him. "Ronald." Patricia's voice was steady, steadier than she felt. "What did you do?" He didn't answer. The FBI was contacted that afternoon. Special Agent Diana Reyes arrived in Albuquerque on June 26, 2024. She was 44 years old, a 20-year veteran of the Bureau who had spent the last decade working cold cases out of the field office in Phoenix. She had seen her share of old crimes resurrected by new evidence, DNA matches, deathbed confessions, witnesses who finally found the courage to speak. But she had never seen anything quite like this. The documents from Ronald Gates's safe told a story that was simultaneously horrifying and banal. The October 12, 1998 memorandum, written on Mesa Verde letterhead and signed by Howard Prescott, outlined the Landis problem in clinical corporate language. A contract geologist had discovered irregularities in the company's waste disposal practices. She had documentation. She had threatened to contact federal regulators. The memorandum recommended immediate action to protect company interests and noted that Mr. Gates will coordinate logistics. The handwritten GPS coordinates corresponded to a location within the Mesa Verde mining site, specifically the sealed entrance to shaft number 7. The resignation letter was a forgery. A comparison with authentic samples of Catherine Landis's handwriting, retrieved from her children's school records and her ex-husband's files, revealed subtle but unmistakable differences in letter formation and pen pressure. The original signature had been copied, probably traced from legitimate documents in her personnel file, but the copyist had made errors that a proper forensic analysis should have caught in 1998. The sheriff's department's budget hadn't allowed for that level of scrutiny. The killers had been lucky. The internal correspondence was even more damning. Emails and handwritten notes between Prescott, Gates, and 2 other Mesa Verde employees, a security contractor named Victor Maldonado and a truck driver named Earl Sykes, discussed cleanup and site preparation and package disposal in terms that left little room for innocent interpretation. Within 72 hours, Special Agent Reyes had assembled a task force. The FBI's Albuquerque field office partnered with the New Mexico State Police, the McKinley County Sheriff's Department, and, crucially, the Environmental Protection Agency's Criminal Investigation Division. Marcus Whitehorse, the retired captain who had investigated the original disappearance 26 years earlier, was brought in as a consultant. He sat in the task force briefing room with the expression of a man who had waited decades for a door to open and finally heard the lock click. "We always knew it was connected to Mesa Verde," he said. "We could feel it, but feeling isn't evidence." And they were careful. They had their story ready before we even started asking questions. "They weren't careful enough," Reyes said. She tapped the folder on the table. "Gates kept records. He kept proof." "Why would anyone do that?" Whitehorse shrugged. "Insurance, protection. If the others ever tried to pin everything on him, he'd have documentation showing they were all involved. It's standard procedure for people who don't trust their co-conspirators." "Which is everyone who's ever committed a conspiracy." "Exactly." The EPA's involvement added another dimension to the investigation. The document suggested that Catherine Landis had been killed not simply because she was a threat, but because she had discovered evidence of systematic environmental crimes, illegal dumping that could expose the company to hundreds of millions of dollars in cleanup costs and criminal penalties. If shaft number 7 contained what the investigators suspected, this wasn't just a murder case. It was an environmental catastrophe that had been hidden for decades. On July 3, 2024, the task force obtained a federal warrant to excavate shaft number 7. The site had changed little in the decades since Mesa Verde's closure. The chain-link fence around the shaft entrance was rusted but intact. The concrete cap, poured sometime in the late 1970s, showed no signs of disturbance, at least none visible to the naked eye. Sagebrush had grown up around the perimeter, and a family of rabbits had made a burrow near the eastern fence post. The desert had been slowly reclaiming what humans had abandoned. But ground-penetrating radar told a different story. The technicians set up their equipment on a Tuesday morning, the high desert sun already brutal by 9 a.m. The radar unit looked like an oversized lawnmower pushed slowly across the ground in overlapping patterns. Its signal penetrated the concrete and the rock beneath, mapping density variations that might indicate voids, disturbances, or buried objects. At 11:47 a.m., the technician operating the unit stopped walking. "Got something," he said. "About 40 feet down, just past the concrete seal. Anomaly in the density pattern. It's big." He continued scanning. More anomalies appeared, not just one buried object, but dozens. Some were small and scattered, others were massive, filling entire chambers of the abandoned mine. The EPA's radiation specialist, a woman named Dr. Elena Marsh, ran a preliminary survey with a portable spectrometer. Her face grew increasingly grim as she reviewed the readings. "We're seeing elevated levels consistent with high-activity waste," she reported to Reyes that evening. "Not just uranium, that would be expected at a mining site. We're detecting cesium-137, strontium-90, americium-241. These are isotopes from medical equipment, industrial sources, nuclear facility waste. This isn't mining byproduct. Someone was using this shaft as an illegal dump for materials that should have gone to licensed disposal facilities." "How much are we talking about?" Dr. Marsh hesitated. "Based on the radar signatures and the radiation profile, I'd estimate over 200 cubic meters of high-level waste. Maybe more. We won't know the full extent until we excavate." "And the health implications?" "Catastrophic. This material has been leaching into groundwater for decades. Every community down-gradient from this site, Grants, Milan, San Rafael, the Navajo communities to the north, they've all been exposed. The cancer clusters that epidemiologists have been tracking in this region since the 1990s, they weren't just from legacy mining contamination. They were from this." Reyes absorbed the information. 4 murders and an environmental disaster. A company that had killed to protect its profits, and in doing so, had poisoned thousands of people. Catherine Landis had discovered the truth and died for it. And for 26 years, nobody had known. The excavation began on July 8, 2024. Heavy equipment was brought in, drilling rigs, concrete cutters, a crane to remove debris. The work was slow and methodical, complicated by the need to preserve potential evidence while also protecting workers from radiation exposure. Everyone on site wore dosimeters and protective suits. Air quality monitors ran continuously. The EPA established the exclusion zone extending half a mile from the shaft entrance. Local media picked up the story within days. News helicopters circled overhead, capturing footage of the excavation that would be broadcast across the nation. Mysterious dig at abandoned uranium mine, the headlines read. FBI searches for remains of family missing 26 years. Environmental disaster uncovered in New Mexico desert. The attention was both helpful and problematic. Helpful because it put pressure on the investigation, ensured resources would be allocated, made it impossible for anyone to quietly close the case. Problematic because it alerted the remaining suspects that their time was running out. On July 12th, Howard Prescott's attorney contacted the FBI to negotiate a proactive interview. Prescott, now 84 years old and living in an assisted care facility in Scottsdale, wanted to clarify his role in the events of 1998. The request was denied. The FBI wasn't interested in clarifications. They were building a case for 4 counts of first-degree murder. On July 14th, the excavation team broke through the concrete cap of shaft number 7. The shaft below was dry and surprisingly stable, its walls reinforced with timber supports that had somehow survived 4 decades underground. The air that rose from the opening was stale and carried a faint metallic tang. Not dangerous, the monitoring equipment confirmed, but unsettling nonetheless. Workers in protective suits descended on cables, their headlamps cutting through darkness that hadn't seen light since 1979. At the 40-foot level, they found the first of the anomalies flagged by the radar, a section of wall that had been crudely rebuilt, the original timbers replaced with newer lumber that hadn't weathered as much as the surrounding wood. The construction was hasty, unprofessional, the work of men who had been in a hurry and hadn't expected anyone to ever look closely. Behind this false wall was a cavity, roughly 8 feet wide and 6 feet deep. Inside the cavity were 4 black plastic bags, each sealed with duct tape, each containing what remained of a human being. The bags were extracted with surgical care and transported to the FBI's forensic laboratory in Quantico. The remains inside were fragmentary. 26 years of decomposition had reduced the bodies to bones and connective tissue, but the forensic anthropologist who examined them was able to establish several critical facts within 48 hours. 4 individuals, 1 adult female, approximately 35 years old at time of death, 3 children, 2 aged approximately 9 to 10 years, 1 aged approximately 5 to 6 years. The adult female showed evidence of blunt force trauma to the skull, a single devastating blow from behind, consistent with an attack using a heavy object such as a pipe or crowbar. The children showed no skeletal trauma. Their cause of death could not be determined from the remains alone, but toxicology analysis of bone marrow samples revealed traces of sodium pentobarbital, a barbiturate commonly used as a sedative. The children had been drugged before they died. DNA analysis confirmed what everyone already knew, but no one wanted to say aloud. The remains belonged to Catherine Landis, Ethan Landis, Olivia Landis, and Grace Landis. 26 years after they vanished from a trailer on County Road 53, the family had finally been found. The deeper excavation of shaft number 7 continued for another 3 weeks. What the teams uncovered confirmed Dr. Marsh's worst predictions. Below the false wall where the Landis family had been hidden, the shaft opened into a series of natural chambers that had been used as an illegal dump since at least 1991. Over 240 cubic meters of radioactive waste had been deposited there. Corroded barrels, leaking containers, medical equipment with peeling radiation symbols, industrial materials that should have been handled at specialized facilities. The cost of legal disposal for this volume of high-level waste would have been approximately $47 million over the period in question. Mesa Verde had saved that money by simply shoving the materials into an abandoned hole in the ground and sealing it shut. The savings had been divided among senior management as bonuses and profit distributions. Howard Prescott alone had received over $3 million in compensation that could be directly traced to the illegal dumping operation. The EPA's preliminary assessment estimated that contaminated groundwater had reached 3 municipal water systems and at least a dozen private wells. Elevated radiation levels were detected in soil samples up to 4 miles from the shaft entrance. The agency initiated a Superfund designation process that would eventually classify the Mesa Verde site as one of the most contaminated locations in the American Southwest. Dr. Marsh's team also began reviewing cancer registries and mortality data for communities in the affected area. The patterns were damning. McKinley County had experienced leukemia rates 340% above the national average since 1995. Thyroid cancer rates were elevated by 280%. Birth defects, stillbirths, and childhood developmental disorders all showed statistically significant increases that correlated with proximity to the Mesa Verde site. Thousands of people had been sickened. Hundreds had likely died. And until now, no one had known why. Catherine Landis had known. She had figured it out from her radiation readings and her disposal manifests, from numbers that didn't add up and a shaft that shouldn't have been contaminated. She had tried to do the right thing, and she had been murdered for it, along with her 3 children. Collateral damage in a corporate calculation that valued profits over human lives. The arrests began on July 22, 2024. Ronald Gates was taken into custody at his Albuquerque home at 6:15 a.m. before he had finished his morning coffee. He offered no resistance. According to the agents who made the arrest, he seemed almost relieved, as if the decades of keeping secrets had worn him down more than any prison sentence ever could. He was photographed in handcuffs being led to a federal vehicle, his face blank, his eyes fixed on something no one else could see. Howard Prescott's arrest was more complicated. His attorneys had anticipated the move and filed an emergency motion arguing that their client was mentally unfit to be detained. Prescott was 84 years old and suffering from vascular dementia, they claimed. He couldn't remember events from last week, let alone from 1998. Arresting him would serve no purpose except to inflict cruelty on a dying man. The court ordered a psychiatric evaluation. 3 forensic psychiatrists examined Prescott over a 2-week period in August 2024. Their findings were unanimous. While Prescott showed moderate cognitive decline consistent with his age and medical history, he retained sufficient mental capacity to understand the charges against him and to participate meaningfully in his own defense. His memory for recent events was impaired, but his recall of the past, including the events of 1998, remained surprisingly intact. "He knows exactly what he did," one psychiatrist noted in her report. "When I asked about the Landis case, his affect changed completely. He became guarded, evasive, defensive. That's not the response of a man who has forgotten. That's the response of a man who remembers and wishes he didn't." Prescott was arrested at his Scottsdale facility on September 4, 2024. He was transported to Albuquerque and held without bail pending trial. Victor Maldonado, the security contractor who had provided the muscle for the operation, had died in 2019, a single-vehicle accident on Interstate 10 outside Las Cruces. His blood alcohol level at the time of the crash was 0.24, 3 times the legal limit. Whether the accident was genuinely accidental or something more deliberate, no one would ever know. Maldonado had taken his secrets to the grave. Earl Sykes, the truck driver who had helped transport the bodies, was living in a mobile home park outside Gallup, 63 years old and disabled by a back injury sustained in a mining accident years after the crime. He was arrested on July 24th and brought to Albuquerque for questioning. Sykes confessed within 4 hours. His statement, given over 2 days of interviews with FBI agents and prosecutors, filled in the gaps that the documentary evidence had left blank. He spoke in a flat, exhausted voice, the voice of a man who had carried a weight for too long and was finally setting it down. The plan had been Prescott's from the beginning. Catherine Landis had discovered the illegal dumping operation through her radiation surveys and her analysis of disposal records. She had documentation, not everything, but enough to trigger a federal investigation if it reached the right hands. She had requested a meeting with Prescott to present her findings, and Prescott had used that meeting to assess the threat she posed. "He called us in that same afternoon," Sykes said. "Me and Vic. Said we had a problem that needed to be solved quickly and permanently. Said the geologist had evidence that could shut down the company and send all of us to prison. Said there was no way to buy her off. She was the type who believed in doing the right thing." Prescott had outlined the plan. Maldonado and Sykes would intercept Catherine after she left work, before she could contact federal authorities. They would take her and the children to a remote location. Prescott had suggested an abandoned ranch house on company property, and eliminate the problem. The bodies would be disposed of in shaft number 7, behind the existing waste, where no one would ever think to look. Gates would handle the administrative details, forging the resignation letter, adjusting the personnel records, preparing the cover story for anyone who asked questions. "He had her signature on file," Sykes explained. "Personnel forms she'd signed when she started. Gates traced it onto the resignation letter. Said he'd done it before for other documents. Made it look professional." The execution had gone almost according to plan. They had waited at Catherine's trailer on the afternoon of October 14th, expecting her to return from work at the usual time. Instead, she had picked up her children early and driven past the trailer at high speed, clearly aware that something was wrong. "She must have seen us," Sykes said. "Or maybe she just sensed it. Some people have that instinct. We had to chase her down on the county road. Vic ran her off into the gravel. The car spun out. We pulled her and the kids out and put them in the van." The children had been crying. Grace, the youngest, had been calling for her mother, for someone named Mr. Buttons. Catherine had tried to fight, had scratched Maldonado's face, drawn blood, screamed for help on an empty road where no one could hear. Vic hit her, just once. She went down and didn't get back up. They had driven to the ranch house, drugged the children with medication Prescott had provided, and waited for them to stop breathing. Then they had loaded all 4 bodies into the van and driven to shaft number 7, where Gates was waiting with the necessary equipment to open the concrete cap and reseal it afterward. The entire operation had taken less than 8 hours. By midnight, Catherine and her children were behind a false wall in an abandoned mine, and the killers were on their way home. "We thought we'd gotten away with it," Sykes said. "After the first year, when nobody came asking real questions, Prescott told us we were clear. Said the company had too much political protection for anyone to dig too deep. And he was right. Nobody ever looked at that shaft. Nobody even asked." He paused, staring at the table between himself and the FBI agents. "I've thought about them every day since. The kids, especially. The little one, with the rabbit. She kept asking where her mommy was. She didn't understand what was happening." He broke down then, 26 years of suppressed guilt finally overwhelming him. The FBI agents let him cry. They had gotten what they needed. Earl Sykes pleaded guilty on October 15, 2024, exactly 26 years after the murders, to 4 counts of second-degree murder and 1 count of conspiracy. In exchange for his full cooperation and testimony against Prescott and Gates, prosecutors agreed to recommend a sentence of 25 years in federal prison. Given his age and health, it was effectively a life sentence. He would die behind bars. The trials of Howard Prescott and Ronald Gates were scheduled for the following year, but proceeded at different paces due to ongoing legal maneuvering. Ronald Gates's trial began on January 13, 2025, in the United States District Court for the District of New Mexico. The prosecution's case was methodical and overwhelming. They presented the documentary evidence from the safe, the memorandum, the GPS coordinates, the forged resignation letter, the internal correspondence. They presented forensic analysis proving the letter was a forgery. They presented the remains recovered from shaft number 7 and the DNA evidence confirming the victims' identities. And they presented Earl Sykes, who took the stand over 3 days and described in excruciating detail exactly what had happened on October 14, 1998, and exactly what role Ronald Gates had played. The defense argued that Gates had been a minor participant, a paper pusher who had forged documents without fully understanding their purpose. He had not been present at the killings. He had not personally harmed anyone. He was guilty, perhaps, of conspiracy and obstruction, but not of murder. The prosecution demolished this argument with Gates's own words. The internal correspondence included a handwritten note from Gates to Prescott, dated October 11, 1998, that read, Landis, disposal site confirmed, logistics arranged, package can be processed by end of week, RG. The word package had been used elsewhere in the correspondence to refer to the bodies of Catherine and her children. The defendant didn't just forge documents, the prosecutor said in closing arguments. He coordinated the murder of a mother and 3 children. He called them a package. He arranged their disposal. He treated 4 human beings like garbage to be processed. And then he kept the records for 26 years, not because he felt guilty, but because he wanted insurance against his co-conspirators. He is not a minor participant. He is a monster. The jury deliberated for 6 hours. On February 19, 2025, they returned a verdict of guilty on all counts. 4 counts of first-degree murder, 4 counts of conspiracy to commit murder, and 12 additional counts related to obstruction of justice, evidence tampering, and environmental crimes. Ronald Gates showed no emotion as the verdicts were read. He had spent his entire career keeping records, maintaining files, cataloging information. Now he was a line item in someone else's system, a name in the federal prison database, a number in the Bureau of Prisons registry. He was sentenced on April 3, 2025, to 4 consecutive terms of life imprisonment without the possibility of parole, plus an additional 45 years for the associated charges. The judge, in delivering the sentence, noted that Gates had shown no remorse throughout the proceedings, had expressed, in fact, more concern about the exposure of his financial crimes than about the deaths of 4 innocent people. You participated in the murder of a woman who was trying to protect her community from the poison your company was spreading, the judge said. You helped kill 3 children. Children who had done nothing except exist as inconvenient witnesses. And you kept the evidence of your crimes in a safe in your home, not as a burden of guilt, but as a weapon to use against others if necessary. There is no sentence this court can impose that adequately reflects the depravity of your actions. But we will do what we can. Howard Prescott's trial began on May 5, 2025. His defense team continued to argue that his cognitive decline made him unfit for prosecution, producing neurologists and geriatric specialists who testified to the progressive nature of his dementia. But the prosecution countered with its own experts, who noted that Prescott's memory for recent events had declined significantly, but his ability to recall and discuss events from 1998 remained remarkably intact. The defendant remembers the Landis case quite clearly, one expert testified. When confronted with specific details, he became defensive and hostile. He attempted to minimize his role, shift blame to others, and justify his decisions based on business necessity. These are not the responses of a man who has forgotten. These are the responses of a man who remembers, understands, and is trying to escape accountability. The trial lasted 4 weeks. Earl Sykes testified again, describing Prescott's role in planning and authorizing the murders. The documentary evidence spoke for itself. Prescott's signature on the memorandum recommending immediate action, his handwritten notes about disposal logistics, his authorization of the payments that had funded the entire operation. The defense's closing argument was an appeal to mercy. Prescott was 85 years old. He was in declining health. He would almost certainly die before completing any significant prison sentence. What purpose would be served by convicting a dying man? The prosecution's response was simple: justice. 4 people were murdered because this defendant decided his profits were more important than their lives, the prosecutor said. For 26 years he lived in comfort while their bones rotted in a hole in the ground. He played golf. He traveled. He enjoyed his retirement. He never lost a moment's sleep over what he had done. The victims don't get a second chance. The victims don't get to argue that they're too old or too sick to face consequences. Catherine Landis will never see her children grow up. Ethan and Olivia will never graduate from high school. Grace will never learn to read, never fall in love, never have children of her own. They were denied every future possibility because this man decided they were inconvenient. He doesn't deserve mercy. He deserves justice. The jury agreed. On June 12, 2025, Howard Prescott was found guilty on all counts. He was sentenced on July 22, 2025, exactly 1 year after his arrest, to 4 consecutive terms of life imprisonment without parole. He listened to the sentence without expression, his face a mask of distant confusion. His attorneys immediately filed an appeal citing his mental competency. The appeal was denied. Prescott was transferred to the Federal Medical Center in Fort Worth, Texas, a facility equipped to handle elderly inmates with significant health needs. He died there on November 3, 2025, 4 months into his sentence, of complications from pneumonia. He was 86 years old. He never expressed remorse for his crimes. His death did not end the legal proceedings. The civil cases continued. The environmental fallout from the Shaft No. 7 discovery had triggered a cascade of lawsuits that would take decades to resolve. The EPA's Superfund designation, finalized in September 2024, made the federal government responsible for initial cleanup costs, estimated at $420 million over 15 years. But the government immediately began pursuing recovery of those costs from every entity that could be held liable. Mesa Verde Mining Corporation had dissolved in 2011, but its assets and insurance policies had been acquired by a series of successor companies. Those companies now found themselves defending claims worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Consolidated Environmental Services, the waste disposal contractor that had fraudulently billed Mesa Verde while the company dumped materials illegally, settled for $78 million after investigators found evidence of their complicity in falsifying records. The class action lawsuits on behalf of affected communities were even larger. Residents of Grants, Milan, San Rafael, and the surrounding Navajo communities filed suit against every surviving party connected to the contamination. The medical monitoring claims alone, covering ongoing health surveillance for thousands of potentially exposed individuals, were estimated at $200 million. Cancer victims and their families sought billions more in compensatory and punitive damages. The first bellwether trials were scheduled for 2027. Legal experts predicted the litigation would continue for at least 20 years. Dr. Elena Marsh, the EPA radiation specialist who had first identified the scope of the contamination, became a regular presence in the affected communities. She attended town halls, answered questions, explained in plain language what had been done to these people and what could be done to help them now. She also testified before Congress, advocating for stronger regulations on radioactive waste disposal and better funding for environmental enforcement. Catherine Landis tried to stop this in 1998, Dr. Marsh said during her congressional testimony. If anyone had listened to her, if anyone had investigated her concerns, thousands of people might have been spared. She paid with her life for doing the right thing. The least we can do is make sure her death wasn't completely in vain. The Catherine Landis Whistleblower Protection Act was introduced in the House of Representatives in March 2026. It would strengthen protections for employees who reported environmental violations and increase penalties for companies that retaliated against them. As of this telling, the bill remained in committee, its fate uncertain. Marcus Whitehorse, the retired captain who had investigated the original disappearance 26 years earlier, was present when the remains were finally interred at a cemetery in Tucson. Catherine's mother had died in 2008, never knowing what had happened to her daughter and grandchildren. But other family members had been located, cousins, an aunt, Derek Landis's sister, who had remained close to the children before the divorce. They gathered on a cool October afternoon, 26 years and 3 days after the family had vanished, and watched 4 caskets lowered into the Arizona earth. The service was small and private. A priest spoke about mercy and justice, about the mysteries of human cruelty and the certainty of divine love. Catherine's aunt read a poem about children who died too young. Derek's sister placed a small stuffed rabbit on Grace's casket, not Mr. Button's, who had been recovered from the trailer floor and was now in an evidence locker somewhere, but a new rabbit, bought specifically for this purpose, a stand-in for what had been lost. Whitehorse stood at the edge of the gathering, his hat in his hands. He had spent his career believing that justice was possible, that patience and persistence could overcome even the most carefully constructed lies. Now, at the end of that career, he had proof. But the proof had come too late for Catherine, too late for Ethan and Olivia and Grace, too late for all the people who had been poisoned by the contamination Catherine had tried to expose. Was it worth it? His wife asked him that night after they had returned to their home in Gallup. All those years, thinking about the case, wondering what happened. Was it worth finally knowing? Whitehorse thought about the question for a long time. The knowing isn't what matters, he finally said. What matters is that someone is held accountable, that the truth gets told, that people understand what happened and why. He paused. Catherine Landis died trying to do the right thing. The least we could do was finish what she started. The headstone, installed a week after the burial, bore 4 names and a simple inscription. Catherine Landis, 1963-1998, Ethan Landis, 1989-1998, Olivia Landis, 1989-1998, Grace Landis, 1993-1998. She told the truth. They silenced her. But truth cannot be buried forever. In Grants, the reaction to the case's resolution was complicated. Some residents expressed relief that a decades-old mystery had finally been solved. Others felt betrayed by the company that had employed them, by the executives they had trusted, by a system that had allowed 4 people to be murdered and buried without consequence for a quarter century. Many struggled with their own complicity. Had they suspected something and stayed silent? Had they accepted jobs and wages from a company they should have questioned? The Grants Beacon published a special edition examining the case and its implications, including an editorial that asked hard questions about what else might be buried in the abandoned mines that dotted the region. The McKinley County Commission voted to establish an independent review of all mining operations in the county, past and present. The state legislature allocated $15 million for a comprehensive health survey of communities affected by uranium contamination. The trailer lot on County Road 53, where Catherine and her children had lived their final years, became something of a pilgrimage site. People left flowers, stuffed animals, handwritten notes. Someone placed a small rabbit with gray ears at the spot where the front steps had once been, a tribute to Grace and to Mr. Buttons, who had been recovered from evidence and, at the family's request, buried with Grace in Tucson. A year after the verdicts, a memorial was dedicated at the site. It was simple, a granite marker with 4 names and a brief inscription, but it stood as permanent testimony to what had happened there. The dedication ceremony was attended by over 300 people, including families of cancer victims from the affected communities, environmental activists, journalists who had covered the case, and ordinary citizens who wanted to pay their respects. Patricia Gates did not attend. She had finalized her divorce in March 2025, receiving the house, the legitimate investment accounts, and a settlement that would keep her comfortable for the rest of her life. The offshore accounts had been seized by federal authorities. The gold coins had been sold at auction to help fund victim compensation. The affair phone had been entered into evidence and eventually destroyed. She never spoke publicly about her ex-husband again, but she did, once, give a statement to a reporter who had been covering the case from the beginning. "I was married to him for 42 years, she said. "I thought I knew him. I thought I understood the kind of man he was, but I didn't know anything. I was living with a stranger the whole time." She paused, looking out the window of her home at the Sandia Mountains in the distance. "Those children," she said, 9 years old, 5 years old. They had their whole lives ahead of them, and he helped take that away, for money, for a company that doesn't even exist anymore." She shook her head. "I keep thinking about the little girl, Grace. She had a stuffed rabbit she took everywhere. I wonder if she was holding it when they—" Her voice broke. She didn't finish the sentence. The reporter asked if she had any regrets about turning over the documents, about being the one whose actions had brought her husband to justice. Patricia Gates looked at him with eyes that had seen too much and understood too late. "My only regret," she said, "is that I didn't open that safe 26 years ago. The silence of the high desert keeps many secrets. Some are ancient, the stories of peoples who lived and died in this land before recorded history began. Some are recent, the quiet tragedies that unfold in small towns where everyone knows everyone's name, but no one asks too many questions. For 26 years, that silence had protected the men who murdered Catherine Landis and her 3 children. It had covered their crime like the desert covers everything, patiently, inexorably, grain by grain. But silence is not the same as forgetting, and the truth, like water, finds its way through even the smallest cracks. In the end, it was not a detective's brilliant deduction that broke the case. It was not a witness coming forward after decades of guilt. It was not new technology or DNA evidence or any of the tools that usually unlock cold cases in the modern era. It was a woman who had been betrayed by her husband, a woman who wanted to know the extent of his lies, a woman who insisted on opening a safe that had been closed for 26 years. Inside that safe was justice, waiting. Catherine Landis never got to tell the world what she had discovered about Mesa Verde Mining Corporation. She never got to see Howard Prescott and Ronald Gates answer for their crimes. She never got to watch her children grow up, graduate, fall in love, have children of their own. But her truth outlived her. Her evidence survived. And in the end, the story she tried to tell about corporate greed, environmental destruction, and the price paid by those who speak out, was told to millions of people who would never have heard it otherwise. She became, in death, what she had always been in life, a woman who refused to stay quiet about things that mattered. The contamination she discovered is being cleaned up now, slowly, expensively, over years that will stretch into decades. The people she tried to protect are finally being tested, treated, compensated. The company that killed her is gone, but its crimes are being accounted for in courtrooms and congressional hearings and EPA reports that will shape environmental policy for generations. And in Grants, New Mexico, where the desert wind still whispers across the mesas and the abandoned mines still dot the landscape like open wounds, people remember. They remember the struggling single mother who lived in an Airstream trailer with her 3 children. They remember the morning she vanished. They remember the questions that were never answered until they were. They remember Catherine Landis. They remember Ethan and Olivia and Grace. And they remember that even the deepest silence cannot keep the truth buried forever.